He fired her in front of 200 executives. He called her unqualified. And 3 days later, he was asking her to save the company. But by then, the damage was irreversible. In the heart of Manhattan, where ambition climbs as high as the glass towers that scrape the clouds, one name rang louder than most along the corridors of power: Marcus Vail. His company, Vail Dynamics, occupied the top 4 floors of a sleek high-rise on Park Avenue, a building where every surface gleamed and every second felt expensive. From his corner office on the 47th floor, Marcus could look down on the city the way he looked down on most things, with a quiet, unspoken certainty that he had already won. Vail Dynamics was not simply a company, it was an empire. Over 2 decades, Marcus had turned a mid-sized acquisitions firm into a billion-dollar powerhouse with offices stretching from New York to Chicago, Houston to Los Angeles. His photograph had appeared on the cover of Forbes twice. Business Insider had called him the last of the true corporate wolves. He wore that description like a badge of honor. Marcus believed in one thing above all else: dominance. Not just in market share or quarterly earnings, but in every room he entered, every meeting he chaired, every handshake he offered. He had built Vail Dynamics on a philosophy of relentless pressure, precision, and control. He kept his senior staff on edge deliberately, convinced that comfort produced complacency. Zero tolerance for mistakes was not a policy. It was a religion. He dressed the part: sharp charcoal suits from a tailor on Fifth Avenue, a Patek Philippe watch that cost more than most of his junior employees made in a year. His office walls held no family photos, only framed deal announcements, signed term sheets, and a single quote etched in brushed steel: "Sentiment is the enemy of success." Nobody who worked for Marcus could claim they had never felt the cold edge of that belief. The culture he built reflected everything he was. Meetings started exactly on time and ran without mercy. Ideas were tested ruthlessly. Weakness, perceived or real, was not tolerated. His senior leadership team, a collection of mostly white men in their late 40s and early 50s, had learned to speak his language fluently. They interrupted each other the way Marcus interrupted everyone. They dismissed dissenting voices the way Marcus dismissed anything that challenged his own view. In 32 states across America, Vail Dynamics operated a portfolio of acquired companies. And in every single one, the tone set at the top on Park Avenue filtered downward like water through cracked stone. In boardrooms from Wall Street to the financial districts of Chicago and Houston, Marcus Vail was considered a genius. In those same rooms he was also feared, and he preferred it that way. Fear, he believed, was more reliable than loyalty. Fear kept people sharp. Fear kept people quiet when he needed them to be. But every empire has its blind spot. Every emperor, no matter how calculating, carries an assumption so deep and so comfortable that he never thinks to question it. For Marcus Vail, that assumption had a name, a desk, and a quiet dignity he had never once bothered to look at closely. Emily Carter had worked at Vail Dynamics for 5 years. Her desk sat on the 46th floor, 1 floor below Marcus, which, in the unspoken geography of the building, meant everything. The executive wing was a rarefied world of mahogany desks, reserved elevator access, and an air of importance so thick you could taste it when the doors opened each morning. Emily moved through that world every single day, and yet somehow remained invisible within it. She was the only black woman in the executive wing. In a company of over 3,000 employees spread across offices from Atlanta to Seattle, that distinction was not lost on her. Nor was it lost on the people who passed her in the hallway each morning without quite meeting her eyes. She had learned in those 5 years to carry that reality with the same quiet composure with which she carried everything else. Her credentials were not in question, at least not on paper. Emily held a bachelor's degree in economics from Princeton University and a master's in corporate finance from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. She had graduated near the top of her class in both programs. She had turned down 3 other job offers to join Vail Dynamics, drawn in by the company's reputation and by a private sense of connection to its founding that she kept mostly to herself. For 5 years, she handled some of the most sensitive work the company produced. She reviewed acquisition contracts before Marcus ever saw them, identifying weaknesses, flagging inconsistencies, catching the kind of errors that, if left unaddressed, would have cost the company millions. She managed confidential board communications, acting as a filter between the chairman's office and the executive team. She tracked investor files with the meticulous precision of someone who understood, at a molecular level, what those numbers meant. And yet the word that followed her everywhere, the word whispered in performance reviews, spoken in hushed tones by colleagues who believed they were complimenting her, was not brilliant or indispensable. It was dependable, articulate sometimes, impressive occasionally, though always with that slight uplift of surprise, as though the speaker had not quite expected it. She had learned to read the subtext beneath those words fluently. In meetings, she poured the coffee, not because it was her job, not because anyone had formally assigned her the task, but because it was the path of least resistance in a room where her presence was already complicated enough. She sat at the far end of the conference table with her notebook open and her pen moving, absorbing every word, every figure, every strategic nuance, while others at that same table were asked for their opinions, their analyses, their instincts. She was not invisible because she lacked presence. She was invisible because certain people in that room had already decided what she was and what she was not before she ever opened her mouth. The erosion had not happened all at once. It had been slow and methodical, the way water wears at rock, not dramatically, but persistently, until the shape of what was once solid becomes something smaller than it used to be. Emily Carter had not walked into Veil Dynamics fragile. She had walked in certain, prepared, and focused. What 5 years of daily, low-grade dismissal had done was not break her. It had sharpened her in ways she had not fully understood yet. The pattern had established itself in the first 6 months. Whenever Emily spoke in meetings, Marcus would let her get 3, maybe 4 sentences in before cutting across her, not rudely, not loudly, but cleanly and completely, the way you close a door on a conversation you've decided you're done having. At first, she assumed it was the rhythm of how he ran his meetings. Then she began to pay attention. When David Harmon from the Boston acquisitions team spoke, Marcus listened with his hands folded. When Grant Phillips offered a projection, Marcus nodded slowly, asked follow-up questions, treated the information as though it had weight. When Emily spoke, the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Phones were consulted, jacket cuffs adjusted, eyes drifted. When she presented data, and she presented it often, because her data was always precise and always timely, Marcus would turn to someone else in the room and say, almost casually, "Can someone verify that?" Not "good point" or "let's build on this." Verify it. As though the figures on the slide behind her might be unreliable, might need a second set of eyes from someone whose judgment he trusted more by default. She kept a private record of those moments, not out of bitterness, out of discipline. She documented the dates, the meetings, the specific exchanges, a habit she had developed at Wharton, where her finance professor had told her once, "If you ever find yourself in a room that doesn't believe you, make sure you can prove what you know." She had not fully understood the weight of that advice at 24. She understood it completely now. When she made suggestions, restructuring a due diligence approach for a pending acquisition in Dallas, proposing a risk mitigation framework for a troubled portfolio company in Phoenix, Marcus would wait a beat after she finished speaking, then say, "Let's hear it from someone with more experience." Someone with more experience. She had 2 advanced degrees and 5 years of working at the precise intersection of finance and corporate strategy. She spoke 4 languages fluently. She had personally reviewed over 200 acquisition contracts in her time at Veil Dynamics. But she understood, without anyone needing to say it plainly, that experience was not what he was actually talking about. The bias was never loud. It never announced itself. It was the kind that lived in the space between words, in who got invited to the smaller dinner after the board meeting and who found out about it the next morning, in who was copied on the strategic memos and who received a summary 3 days later, in who was brilliant and who was dependable. It was the kind of bias that could be argued away, explained away, rationalized away by anyone who wanted to rationalize it. But Emily had stopped wanting to rationalize it a long time ago. What kept her at Veil Dynamics was not hope that Marcus would change. She had released that particular hope quietly and without drama sometime in her 3rd year, the same week she learned the full details of what her father had left behind. Daniel Carter had co-founded Veil Dynamics 30 years ago, not as an investor or a silent partner, but as the structural architect of the company's original acquisitions model, the framework that Marcus had built everything on top of. Daniel Carter had died when Emily was 19, before she fully understood what his legacy meant or what it might one day mean for her. He had left his 18% ownership stake in a trust with specific activation conditions that only Emily could trigger. She had sat with that knowledge for 2 years saying nothing, not because she was afraid, because she was patient, because she understood at a level Marcus Vail never would that timing was its own form of power, and because she had been watching the pattern, watching the culture, watching the board, building relationships, quietly, personally, one conversation at a time, with 3 board members who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the direction Marcus was taking the company. The autocratic decision-making, the hostile internal environment, the string of overlooked employees who had filed complaints that went nowhere, the undercurrent of grievance that had been building on the floors below the executive wing for years. Emily had not been waiting for permission or rescue. She had been waiting for the right moment. And as the quarterly earnings meeting approached, the one where she knew the acquisition projections were going to be badly misrepresented, because she had reviewed the original reports and seen exactly where the numbers were going to diverge, she felt, for the first time in 5 years, something settle in her chest like a key turning in a lock. She was not planning revenge. She was not planning a scene. She was planning something far quieter and far more permanent. She was planning a correction, and all she needed was the moment Marcus Vail would hand her, the moment he always handed people he underestimated, when he would look across a room of 200 people and remind everyone exactly who he thought she was. He did not disappoint her. The breaking point. The quarterly earnings meeting was held in Veil Dynamics' main conference room on the 47th floor, a vast, glass-walled space with views stretching from the Hudson River to the east side, where New York City looked exactly like the kind of stage a man like Marcus Vail would want for his performance. 200 executives, investors, and board members had flown in from across the country, from Chicago, from Dallas, from the San Francisco office, from the Miami portfolio division. The room hummed with the particular energy of people who expected important things to be said. Marcus presented with the ease of a man who had never once doubted his own authority. He moved through slides on market expansion, operational efficiency, projected synergies from 3 pending acquisitions in the Southeast. His tone was assured, his manner commanding. The room listened the way rooms always listened to Marcus Vail. Then he reached the acquisition projection slide, and he quoted the wrong number, not by a small margin, by a figure significant enough that 3 investors in the second row exchanged a look that Emily, seated near the end of the table with her notebook open, caught immediately. She also caught the way 2 board members straightened in their chairs, because she had sent each of them the correct version of the report 48 hours earlier. She leaned forward. She kept her voice level professional, pitched only loud enough to be heard clearly across the table. "Sir, that projection is from last quarter's report. 7 words, factual, without edge." The room's energy shifted. Marcus turned slowly, stared at her, and smiled the way people smile when they are not actually amused. He said, "So now you're the financial expert." A few uncomfortable chuckles filled the air, the anxious kind, offered by people who were not sure what else to do with themselves. Emily stayed calm. She began to clarify, referencing the document on the slide. He interrupted her before she could finish the sentence. "Emily, you're here to assist, not to correct." He let the word assist hang in the air. Then added, "Let's not confuse support roles with leadership." The room went silent because everyone understood what he meant and who he was saying it to. He straightened his jacket and added, with an almost paternal concern in his voice, "Maybe this environment is too high pressure. If you're overwhelmed, we can find you something more suitable." Emily nodded once. She was composed, she was professional. She was also, in that moment, absolutely finished waiting. After the meeting, Emily Carter did not cry. She did not pace the hallway outside the conference room, steadying herself against the wall the way she had seen others do after difficult encounters with Marcus Vail. She did not call a friend, did not seek out a sympathetic colleague, did not file anything with HR. She walked back to her desk on the 46th floor with the particular steadiness of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment for a very long time and has just watched it arrive exactly on schedule. She sat down. She opened her laptop. The cursor blinked in the silence of her office, a small, tidy space that she had made her own in quiet ways. A single framed photograph of her father on the corner of the desk, a small succulent near the window, a shelf of finance textbooks that she actually read. She pulled up her email. Marcus, she knew, assumed she would resign. This was the pattern she had watched him use before, not an outright termination, but a public diminishment so complete and so deliberate that the target had no dignified option but to leave. 2 years ago, he had done the same thing to a senior analyst named Jerome Washington, a 12-year company veteran who had challenged a real estate projection during a Chicago investor meeting. Jerome had been gone within a week. Before him, a woman named Patricia Ling in the San Francisco office had been talked over and sidelined in exactly the same way until she took a position at a competitor. The method was clean precisely because it left no paper trail. Nobody was fired. Nobody filed a wrongful termination claim. People simply felt the environment become so hostile, so airless, that leaving felt like breathing. Emily Carter was not going to leave. She had never intended to leave. She was about to change the entire geometry of the situation, not loudly, not dramatically, but through the quiet mechanics of corporate governance and a trust document that had been sitting in a law office on Lexington Avenue for 4 years, waiting for her signature. The email she composed was precisely worded and exactly 4 sentences long. It was addressed to the chairman of the Vail Dynamics board, with copies to 3 board members she had been cultivating relationships with over the past 18 months, quiet lunches, considered conversations, the kind of measured trust building that takes patience and pays in compounding interest. The subject line read, "Board Authorization, Emergency Vote." The body of the email contained a formal request for an emergency board session, a notice of intent to activate her ownership trust, and a single attached file, the legal documentation confirming Emily Carter as the holder of an 18% stake in Vail Dynamics, inherited from her late father, Daniel Carter, co-founder. She hit send at 4:47 in the afternoon. By 5:15, her phone had received 2 responses. By 7:30, a board session had been scheduled for 2 days hence. She powered down her laptop, picked up her bag, and took the elevator down to the lobby without stopping to speak to anyone. Outside, New York City moved at its usual relentless pace, and Emily Carter walked into it with the particular calm of someone who has just moved a piece on a board that other people have not realized is being played. It is worth pausing here to understand what Emily had carried through 5 years at Vail Dynamics, not as abstraction, but as lived daily reality. Every morning, she had taken the 6 train from her apartment in Harlem down to Grand Central, then walked 4 blocks to the Park Avenue Tower. Every morning, she had swiped her badge, ridden the executive elevator, and entered a world that had been built in almost every structural detail without her in mind. Not against her precisely, But not for her either. That particular variety of exclusion is its own kind of weight. It is the weight of having to translate yourself constantly, of managing other people's comfort with your presence while simultaneously doing the actual work. She had managed it with grace because she understood something that Marcus Vail did not. Grace is not weakness. Composure is not submission. The ability to endure without breaking is not the same as accepting what you are being asked to endure. For 5 years, Emily had been the most informed person in almost every meeting she attended. She had caught errors that would have embarrassed the company in front of investors. She had negotiated language in contracts that saved Vail Dynamics from liability on at least 4 separate occasions, that she knew of occasions that were later praised in board communications, without any attribution to her specifically. She had also, quietly and deliberately, built something else. The 3 board members she had aligned with: Richard Acaffer from the Governance Committee, Susan Brennan, who chaired the Audit Committee, and James Whitfield, a long-time independent director who had grown increasingly vocal about what he called the cultural drift at Vail Dynamics, had not come to her side out of sentiment. They had come because Emily had, over 18 months, demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and strategic clarity that they felt was missing from the executive leadership. She had not lobbied them. She had not complained to them about Marcus. She had simply been present, been competent, and been honest, and in a company where those qualities had become increasingly rare, they had noticed. The ownership stake was not a surprise weapon. It was not a trick. It was simply information that she had the right to use and had chosen, after careful deliberation, to use now. Her father's 18% had been held in a discretionary trust managed by a firm in Midtown Manhattan, with activation terms that required Emily's formal written request and the filing of notification to the company's registered agent. The whole process, once initiated, was clean and straightforward. She had reviewed the paperwork with her attorney, a woman named Diane Foster, who operated a boutique corporate law firm on Madison Avenue 6 weeks earlier. Everything had been in order. Everything had been ready. She had simply been waiting for Marcus to give her the reason she would never have to explain or defend. He had given her 200 witnesses. 2 days later, Marcus Vail walked into the Vail Dynamics boardroom on the 47th floor with the irritated energy of a man who considers unscheduled meetings an imposition. He had been told only that an emergency session had been called, that attendance was mandatory, and that the agenda would be disclosed upon arrival. He assumed it was a contractual matter. Perhaps one of the Phoenix portfolio companies had run into a regulatory issue, or the Chicago real estate deal had hit a snag. He straightened his tie in the hallway outside and pushed open the door. Emily Carter was seated at the main table, not standing, not holding a tablet or a notepad or a tray of anything, seated directly to the left of the chairman in one of the 12 leather chairs that ringed the table. The chairman was already present. 3 board members sat in their usual positions. 2 attorneys from the company's external counsel were positioned near the credenza along the wall. Marcus stopped, his jaw tightened visibly. "What is she doing here?" He directed the question at the chairman with the tone of a man who is used to questions like that being answered immediately and in his favor. The chairman did not blink. He slid a manila folder across the polished surface of the table and told Marcus he should review page 4. Marcus opened it. He found a single-page ownership summary prepared by the company's external counsel and verified by the trust administrator. Emily Carter, 18%, co-founder's estate, activated. His face did something complicated, the color shifting, the expression cycling through disbelief and then a rapid recalculation. He looked across the table at her. "You planned this," he said. It was not quite a question. She looked back at him with the same even composure she had maintained for 5 years in rooms exactly like this one. "No," she said, "I endured this." Silence filled the room. "For 5 years, I listened while you questioned my credentials." For 5 years, you asked others to confirm my numbers. For 5 years, you assumed I was here because of diversity optics. A board member shifted uncomfortably. She continued, "You never once asked who my father was. You never once asked how I understood this company so well. You just assumed." Marcus tried to regain control. "You're being emotional." She did not raise her voice. "I'm being strategic." Another silence. And strategy doesn't tolerate leadership built on bias. The silence that followed those words was the kind that has texture to it, dense and specific, carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Emily let it sit. She did not fill it. She did not rush. She had learned, in 5 years of being talked over and interrupted, exactly how much can be communicated by allowing silence to exist on your own terms. When she spoke again, her voice remained level. She was not performing anger. She was not performing triumph. She was being precise, which had always been her most natural register. She told the room that for 5 years she had worked in an environment where her credentials were questioned as a matter of routine, not through formal challenge, but through the daily mechanics of exclusion that everyone in that room had witnessed and most had chosen not to name. She said that for 5 years her data had been sent for verification by people whose data was never sent for verification. She said that she had been asked to pour coffee in meetings where she had reviewed every document under discussion before any other person in the room had seen them. She spoke for approximately 7 minutes without interruption. This was, she noted internally, the longest she had spoken in a Veil Dynamics meeting in 5 years without being cut off. Marcus tried once around the 4-minute mark, when she described the quarterly earnings meeting, leaning forward with the familiar energy of a man about to reassert control. Richard Acaffer, the board governance chair, placed a quiet hand flat on the table in front of him and said, "Let her finish." And Marcus, for perhaps the first time in 20 years, did not speak. She concluded by addressing the governance matter directly. She had, she explained, aligned her voting rights with 3 board members on a motion of no confidence in the current CEO, citing a documented pattern of discriminatory conduct, a hostile work environment, and leadership decisions that had materially undermined the company's internal culture and long-term stability. The motion required a majority of voting shares to carry. With her 18% combined with the board members' collective stake, the threshold had been reached. Marcus's response, when he finally spoke, was the last refuge of a man who has run out of more sophisticated options. "You're being emotional," he said. She looked at him, not coldly, but with an absolute clarity that required no volume to land. "I'm being strategic." Then she added, for the benefit of everyone else in the room, "And strategy doesn't tolerate leadership built on bias." The motion was called. The procedure was formal, conducted by the external attorneys according to the company's articles of incorporation. Board members stated their votes aloud. The result was not close. Hand after hand rose in favor of the motion, not for Marcus, for Emily's motion, for accountability, for change, for the kind of correction that organizations rarely make from the inside unless something forces the issue. When the final count was confirmed, the chairman announced the result with the particular measured calm of someone who has spent decades in rooms where important things are decided. Effective immediately, Marcus Vail was removed as CEO of Veil Dynamics. Security was waiting outside the boardroom door, not as an insult, though Marcus experienced it as one, but as standard protocol in executive transitions involving contested leadership. Marcus stood slowly. He was 61 years old. He had built this company from a mid-sized firm in a midtown Manhattan office to a billion-dollar enterprise with a national footprint. He had eaten in every great restaurant in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. He had shaken hands with senators and sovereign wealth fund managers. He had been photographed at galas and featured in profiles and quoted in op-eds about American business. And now he was standing in the boardroom of his own company being asked, by his own security team, to collect his personal effects. He looked at Emily one last time. "You're making a mistake," he said, with the conviction of a man who still believed, on some fundamental level, that the outcome could be revised if he just said the right thing with enough authority. Emily held his gaze. Her expression did not change. "No," she said quietly, "the mistake was thinking I was just the help." He left. The door closed behind him. The room held a particular kind of stillness, not celebratory, not somber, but the stillness of something having been corrected after too long being wrong. The days immediately following Marcus Vail's removal were watched closely, by the company's investors, by the financial press, and by the employees of Vail Dynamics in every office from New York to Seattle. Transition periods at major corporations are volatile by nature, and there had been quiet concern in certain quarters of the financial community that instability at the top would rattle the stock and unsettle operations. It did not. Within 72 hours of the announcement, the company's stock price, which had been drifting downward for 3 consecutive quarters, a trend that the board's internal analysis attributed in part to declining employee retention and a string of high-profile executive departures, stabilized. By the end of the week, it had risen modestly. Analysts who covered Vail Dynamics noted the shift in tone from the company's communications. The language had moved from aggressive and opaque to measured and transparent. The cause was apparent to anyone paying attention. Inside the company, the change was felt differently and more immediately. In the New York headquarters and in offices across Chicago, Houston, Atlanta, and Los Angeles, something shifted in the internal atmosphere within days. Employees who had been filing informal complaints about the work environment for years began to find those complaints acknowledged in ways they had not been before. 3 senior employees who had been quietly sidelined in the final year of Marcus's tenure, a woman in the Dallas office, a man in the Chicago acquisitions division, a non-binary analyst in the San Francisco tech portfolio team, were reinstated to their previous roles and offered formal apologies. The executive floor, which had for years carried the particular atmosphere of a room where everyone is performing confidence while quietly afraid, began to feel in small ways, in gradual ways, like a place where actual work could happen, where an idea could be offered without knowing in advance who would be asked to verify it, where the word dependable might mean what it was supposed to mean, rather than what it had been made to mean. Emily Carter was appointed interim CEO pending a formal search process. She declined several interview requests from business publications in the first 2 weeks, issuing instead a brief statement through the company's communications office that focused entirely on operational matters, the transition plan, the structural priorities, the framework for a culture review. She did not speak publicly about Marcus Vail or about what had happened in that boardroom. She did not need to. The facts had spoken with more eloquence and more permanence than any statement she could have offered. 3 days after the transition, Marcus left a voicemail on her office phone. She listened to it once. He said they could work things out, that there had been misunderstandings, that he believed, despite everything, there was still a path to collaboration. His voice carried the particular quality of a man who has spent his entire adult life being the most powerful person in every room and has not yet fully absorbed the reality that this is no longer true. She did not respond. She deleted the message. Some lessons do not require conversation. They require only that their consequences be allowed to stand. There is a question that tends to emerge whenever a story like this reaches its conclusion. A question that splits opinions cleanly along the fault lines of how people understand power, accountability, and the long arc of institutional change. The question is this: was Marcus Vail simply a tough leader who pushed too hard in a competitive environment? Or was he a man blinded by bias so ingrained and so comfortable that he had never once stopped to examine it? The honest answer is that it is probably both, and that this is precisely what makes the story instructive rather than merely satisfying. Marcus Vail was not a cartoon villain. He had, in genuine ways, built something remarkable. Vail Dynamics employed thousands of people. It had created real value, executed real deals, driven real growth across American markets from the financial hubs of New York and Chicago to the emerging commercial corridors of Phoenix and Atlanta. His instincts about acquisitions were often correct. His strategic judgment, in areas where he was not clouded by assumption, was sharp. But his instincts about people, about who deserved to be heard, whose intelligence was self-evident and whose required constant verification, who was a leader and who was support, were shaped by something he had never interrogated. He had risen in a world that confirmed his assumptions at every turn, and he had mistaken that confirmation for truth. He had never had to question whether the people he overlooked were actually less capable or simply less familiar to a set of assumptions he had inherited and never examined. Emily Carter had understood something that Marcus never did, that endurance and strategy, deployed with patience and precision, are a form of power that dominance cannot anticipate, because dominance assumes that the people it diminishes will either comply or leave. It has no real framework for the possibility that they are watching, building, and waiting. It has no vocabulary for the kind of quiet, compounding preparation that does not announce itself until the moment it is too late to respond to. The real question, the one that lingers past the boardroom, past the stock report, past the press release, is what it means when institutions are corrected not by the systems designed to correct them, but by the individuals those systems failed. Vail Dynamics had a human resources department. It had a board of directors. It had policies and procedures and compliance frameworks stretching across 32 states. None of those systems had protected Emily Carter or Jerome Washington or Patricia Ling. None of those systems had flagged, formally or informally, what was plainly visible to everyone who sat in those meetings and watched Marcus Vail direct his dismissals at specific people in specific ways. What changed things was one woman who had decided, long before the quarterly earnings meeting, that the moment was coming, and who had spent the intervening time making sure that when it came, she was ready. That is not a story about revenge. Revenge is reactive. It requires being hurt first and then striking back. What Emily Carter did was strategic, patient, and ultimately structural. She did not tear anything down. She corrected a misalignment that had existed from the beginning, between who held power and who had earned it. Whether Marcus Vail deserved what happened to him is, in the end, the wrong question. The right question, the one that every executive floor in every glass tower in every American city might usefully sit with, is simpler and harder at the same time. Who is in the room right now that you are not actually hearing? And what are they already prepared to do about it?